Welcome to Sleepy Tales, a place where myths, legends, and ancient stories are told slowly and softly to help you drift into a peaceful sleep. Before we begin, I'd love for you to share where you're from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel, and if you enjoy relaxing stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a night of our peaceful tales. Now, settle in, relax, and allow tonight's bedtime story carry you into sleep.
Today we will explore the epic tale of Achilles, the Greek hero who had everything, strength, beauty and swagger, except for one tiny, incredibly important thing, his heel. In this video, we'll dive into the surprisingly relatable saga of a man who could slay gods, but couldn't be bothered to protect his one weak spot. Achilles was born a hero, which in ancient Greek terms meant he was either destined for greatness or destined to die very young, preferably both for dramatic effect. His life began like most legends, with a sea goddess, a reluctant king, a skipped paternity test, and a prophecy that ruined everything before it even started. Thetis, Achilles' mother, was a minor sea deity, which meant she had the power to command the waves, transform into various aquatic creatures, and be generally ignored by the major gods unless they needed a convenient plot device. Zeus, ever the opportunist, took one look at her and considered adding her to his growing collection of divine conquests. This was back when Zeus was still under the illusion that every woman, mortal, nymph, or occasionally a tree was just waiting to be seduced by an omnipotent sky pervert. Unfortunately for him, a prophecy ruined the mood. It stated that Thetis would bear a son stronger than his father. This was the ancient Greek equivalent of a nuclear deterrent. Not even Zeus, with his ego stretched over Mount Olympus like a circus tent, wanted to create a child who might one day bench press the cosmos and dethrone him. For once in his career, Zeus chose restraint. In Greek mythology, this moment is rarer than a healthy father-son relationship. So, Thetis was married off to a mortal instead, Peleus, a man best known for being reasonably handsome and not accidentally sleeping with his sister. The gods, determined to make the best of a doomed union, hosted a wedding feast. It went about as well as any divine social event. One uninvited guest crashed the party, threw a golden apple labelled "to the fairest," and indirectly launched the Trojan War 20 years early. Achilles hadn't even been born yet, and his life was already being written by chaos agents with a flair for melodrama. Once pregnant, Thetis embraced motherhood with the calm, nurturing energy of someone trying to cheat death with home remedies. She had one goal: make her baby immortal. Unfortunately, there were no guidebooks for this. Immortality was usually handed out arbitrarily by the gods to heroes, demigods, and occasionally a cow. Thetis, however, took matters into her own slippery, saltwater hands. Her first attempt was the infamous heel dip method. She held Achilles by the ankle and dunked him into the river Styx, a magical waterway that granted invulnerability because nothing says safe like submerging an infant in death-adjacent fluids. The result? 99.9% invincible. The heel she clutched remained painfully mortal, like a forgotten checkbox on a liability waiver. To Thetis's credit, it was a very small oversight, but history has a cruel way of focusing on the parts you miss. Her second attempt involved an entirely different strategy: nightly fire roasting. This entailed placing the infant Achilles into flames to burn away his mortal weaknesses. Think of it as the ancient Greek version of cryotherapy, but with more risk of screaming and smoke damage. Peleus, being inconveniently human and less familiar with divine parenting trends, walked in one night and interrupted the process. Shocked by the sight of his baby roasting like a festive yam, he screamed, which caused Thetis to scream, which caused her to abandon the family altogether. She vanished back into the sea, offended by mortal panic and tired of having her parenting questioned by men who couldn't even hold their breath for 30 seconds. Thus, Achilles grew up motherless, invulnerable in most places, and cursed with the kind of destiny that Greek heroes couldn't seem to avoid, no matter how many times their parents dipped, boiled, or abandoned them. His father Peleus, left with the unenviable task of raising a semi-divine toddler solo, decided to outsource the job to someone who had at least one hoof in the world of mythology. Enter Chiron, a centaur, not the wild kind who smashed furniture at wine parties, but the wise, bearded, mentor variety. Chiron was the go-to tutor for children with mythological baggage. He taught Achilles medicine, music, hunting, and how to pretend you're emotionally well-adjusted while harbouring a deep, burning need for glory. These skills would later serve Achilles in war, heartbreak, and PR campaigns. Achilles flourished under Chiron's guidance, which mostly meant he became physically perfect, emotionally stunted, and increasingly aware that greatness required a spectacular death. The Greek pantheon was a lot like Hollywood. If you wanted to be remembered, you needed a tragic ending and preferably an iconic pose. Achilles wasn't quite ready for the dying part yet, but he was mentally penciling it in. Meanwhile, other gods occasionally checked in. Hera gave a disapproving nod. Athena made a note for future battlefield endorsements. Poseidon pretended not to notice the sea-nymph connection, and Zeus, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of ego, kept an occasional eye on Achilles, reminding himself that not seducing Thetis was still the right call. Even if Achilles was beginning to look suspiciously like the kind of man who could someday flip Olympus on its head if sufficiently annoyed. Despite being a living prophecy, Achilles spent his early years in relative peace, sprinting through forests, javelining things that didn't need javelining, and radiating the kind of dangerous handsomeness usually reserved for perfume ads. His legend was beginning to form, slowly, subtly, like mould on old bread or fan theories in a Netflix series. But even legends need a catalyst, and for Achilles, that catalyst was fate, which in Greek mythology functioned like a clingy ex, impossible to avoid and always showing up at the worst possible time. It's worth noting that Thetis never really left. She just operated on sea mother terms, which involved showing up occasionally in prophetic dreams, manipulating war logistics, and quietly bribing gods to keep Achilles alive long enough to fulfill the right kind of death. She was, in short, a divine helicopter parent with an unusually long leash and a very specific vision board. Achilles, for his part, wasn't terribly sentimental about the whole missing mother, deadbeat father thing. His personality was already settling into its final form, proud, explosive, uncoachable. He could play the lyre with haunting precision, heal wounds with divine herbs, and murder a man with alarming grace. but ask him to compromise or handle emotional rejection with dignity, and he was suddenly very 12 years old again. He was aware of his strength, and worse, so was everyone else. Rumours about the boy who could outrun the wind and punch through armour made their way across kingdoms. He hadn't yet picked a fight with history, but it was clear from the way it looked at him that it was only a matter of time. Meanwhile, mortals continued to make terrible decisions. Across the sea, a prince named Paris would soon steal the wrong woman, launch 1,000 ships, and turn an entire city into a metaphor. The gods were circling, bets were being placed, and Achilles' name was slowly being etched into the guest list of fate's biggest, bloodiest event, the Trojan War. For now, though, he remained in Prelude, invulnerable except where it counted, raised by a centaur, groomed by prophecy, and completely unaware that his legacy would someday be reduced to a vulnerable footnote and a controversial heel. Achilles was ready. Or more accurately, he would be ready just as soon as someone figured out how to lure him into a war without mentioning the part where he definitely, absolutely 100% would die. But that was a problem for another part. Achilles' childhood was, to put it mildly, a little unusual. It's one thing to be the son of a sea goddess and a mortal king, but it's quite another to be raised by a centaur. To most people, centaurs were mythological creatures, half human, half horse, and wholly irresponsible when it came to public behaviour. But Chiron, the centaur who took Achilles under his wing, wasn't that kind of centaur. He was the philosopher-mentor type. So much so that it was hard to remember he also had hooves and a tail. Chiron was a nice, thoughtful guy who'd learned how to use the lower half of his body for things other than just running through forests and ruining dinner parties. He wasn't just a centaur. He was a walking, talking curriculum for demigods in need of a moral compass and some basic life skills. Achilles, meanwhile, was still trying to figure out what it meant to be the world's most eligible hero. Spoiler alert, he didn't figure it out, and the world, like a child with a crayon, was too busy scribbling over his destiny to let him. To be clear, Achilles had some very specific talents. He could fight like a thunderstorm wrapped in leather, and had the sort of good looks that made gods pause their eternal arguments, and gods and mortals alike rearranged their schedules for a second look. He didn't, however, know how to properly deal with an emotional crisis, which was odd, considering he was practically built for one. As a child, Achilles was tutored in all the necessary hero skills. This, of course, was essentially a crash course in aggression and lyre plucking, because why not mix epic combat skills with being an emotional wreck who can carry a tune? Achieving legendary status in Greek mythology required the right balance of violence, artistic expression, and casual narcissism. But Achilles, being Achilles, took more interest in the wrestling and sword-fighting parts, largely because they didn't require feelings, which was convenient since he was still working on understanding his own. Training with Chiron was as idyllic as it was traumatic. Achilles learned to wield a sword like someone whose emotions could only be expressed through actions that left people either very dead or very impressed. Chiron, for his part, taught him things like basic ethics and how to keep a cool head, which for Achilles meant how to not instantly murder people when someone says something mildly irritating. Chiron also introduced him to the joys of playing the lyre, which Achilles took to with all the enthusiasm of someone asked to play a kazoo at a funeral. Playing the lyre was a good way to let off some steam after a particularly violent wrestling match, but it wasn't going to keep your name alive for centuries. Being able to play a sad song after decapitating your enemies wasn't what legends were made of. They needed a certain level of emotional complexity, which Achilles had yet to develop. After an undetermined amount of time spent in Chiron's cosy woodland lair, where Achilles grew into his impressive muscles, his fame, and his profound lack of self-awareness, he hit the age where his inevitable heroism began to catch up with him. As it turns out, being a famous demigod with a giant target on your chest doesn't make for the best childhood. But the Greeks were notoriously bad at protecting their children from their own destinies. Achilles, despite his penchant for deflecting emotional problems, couldn't avoid the looming shadow of war, specifically the Trojan War. The gods, ever the meddling sort, decided it was time to give Achilles a choice. The problem with choice in Greek mythology was that it usually meant choose between two really terrible things. Achilles was presented with two options: go to war and live forever in stories, or stay at home and die obscurely but with a longer life. Achilles, naturally, was someone who believed that fame and glory were the only things worth living for. He wasn't about to be remembered for his long, fulfilling life of mediocrity. So, the war was on the horizon, and Achilles needed to make some preparations. But Achilles wasn't quite ready to leap into destiny with the enthusiasm of a man with nothing to lose. So, in a move that would later be celebrated as the greatest act of passive resistance in the history of demigods, Achilles decided to avoid the war altogether. He did this by doing what any child of a sea goddess would. He went into hiding. Now, hiding as a demigod doesn't just mean going off to your room to sulk and maybe journal about it for an hour. No, Achilles had to get creative. Under the guidance of his ever-practical mother Thetis, he was sent to the island of Syros. There, he was disguised as a girl in a failed attempt at blending in. This strategy, however, required Achilles to do something he wasn't good at: appearing average. Achilles, like all Greek heroes, was naturally inclined to stand out. He was the kind of person who could walk into a room and instantly draw the attention of every single person in it, whether they wanted to look at him or not, which, as it turns out, was less than ideal when you're trying to pose as a nondescript young lady. Thetis, forever the stage mom, went all out with the disguise. She dressed Achilles in a flowery gown and stuffed his chest with fabric. She even gave him a name, Pyrrha, a name so bland that even the village elders would be too distracted by how unremarkable it sounded to realise they were hosting an uninvited hero. Achilles, for his part, made an excellent girl, by Greek standards. He played his part so well that no one was the wiser for about a week. But Achilles had a problem that not even the most well-crafted disguise could fix. He was too good-looking. Unfortunately, being too good-looking has its drawbacks. Even when disguised as a girl, Achilles had a way of radiating an unnerving level of beauty. The other women on the island couldn't help but notice, and soon Achilles was the centre of attention. which is always a bad sign when you're trying to stay under the radar. And there was also the matter of his superior strength. It's hard to pretend you're just a regular young woman when you can casually throw boulders across a field. Not to mention, Achilles had a remarkable ability to wield his weapons even when they were poorly disguised as ladies' accessories. The entire scheme fell apart when Achilles, in a moment of youthful exuberance, decided to throw a discus for fun. The sound of the discus soaring through the air, followed by a dramatic thud as it landed in the sand, was enough to draw attention. The ruse was up, and suddenly Achilles was faced with a choice. Continue living on a remote island with a bunch of women who would eventually wonder why he looked like he could wrestle an ox, or accept his fate and go fight in the Trojan War. He chose the latter, because even the mildest war was a step up from wearing a dress and pretending to be something he clearly was not. As if the gods were playing a cruel joke on him, Achilles was then presented with the news that his old friend Odysseus was the one to trick him out of hiding. Odysseus, ever the schemer, had sent word that all the greatest warriors were being called to Troy. Achilles, on his way out of the island's gate, gave one last longing look at the life he might have had he not been so genetically predisposed to greatness. Odysseus, with a grin wide enough to make anyone suspicious, lured Achilles back into the fold. He didn't even need to use the word on the street method that would have made anyone else nervous. Achilles was already more or less sold on the idea of heroism by default. So, Achilles returned to the world of battle, now fully armed with the skills that Chiron had taught him, none of which were particularly useful unless you wanted to make a dramatic entrance, and most of which involved a lot of raw strength and no emotional regulation whatsoever. And thus, Achilles marched back onto the stage of history, ready to fulfill his destiny, only to realize that, in Greek mythology, even the best laid plans tend to go sideways. In the case of Achilles, sideways meant an entire war filled with glory, but also a much shorter life than anyone really anticipated. After much deliberation and several hours spent staring at the ocean, Achilles, the demigod with a serious commitment to dramatics, decided that he would in fact go to war. It wasn't that he liked fighting. No one could possibly think that, given how quickly he defaulted to sulking when things didn't go his way. It was just that living a long, peaceful life sounded about as appealing to him as spending eternity in a room full of pious priests talking about how good it was to be good. Achilles was all about glory, fame, and, let's be honest, an absurd amount of attention. A long life where he might be able to take up knitting and have grandkids wasn't going to get him any Instagram followers in 1,000 years, let alone remembered forever by bards. Thus, with a deep sigh and an emotional speech that would have made his mother Thetis proud, Achilles sailed off to Troy. There he was, a demigod among mortals, fully aware that this would be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to add some real drama to his resume. War, after all, was the perfect setting for him to showcase his abilities to whine loudly, sulk dramatically, and sulk while being slightly less dramatic. Because hey, war was nothing if not the stage for all his personal emotional turmoil. But unlike your typical warrior who might rush headlong into battle, Achilles had a very specific agenda. He needed an audience for his greatness. Achilles didn't just want to fight in the war. He wanted the world to know that he, personally, was important. He didn't want to be a cog in a machine. He didn't want to just be another face in the Trojan carnage. No, he wanted everyone to know he was special. And if he had to murder some people along the way for that to happen, well, that was just the price of fame. So, in the grand tradition of heroism, Achilles needed an emotional support human. Enter Patroclus, a fellow Greek who, whether he liked it or not, was more or less dragged into Achilles' vortex of emotional dependency. They were close, so close in fact, that the nature of their relationship has been the subject of many debates by people who clearly had too much free time. Whether it was love, friendship, or some complex hybrid of the two that we don't have a word for in the English language is a mystery no one has fully resolved. But Patroclus was Achilles' rock, his anchor, his everything, except when Achilles was being selfish. And then Patroclus was essentially his unpaid therapist. In any case, Patroclus' role in this war was not exactly set in stone. Unlike Achilles, Patroclus wasn't a demigod with a knack for being utterly insufferable. He was, however, incredibly loyal to his friend. So loyal that he would later make the fatal mistake of thinking he could wear Achilles' armour. This would ultimately lead to his untimely death. But that came later. For now, Patroclus was just Achilles' emotional support companion in a land full of battle-hardened, hormonally imbalanced men. A more supportive friend you couldn't ask for. The war, predictably, dragged on. If there's one thing the Greeks and Trojans knew how to do, it was prolong a conflict for a decade without accomplishing much of anything. Achilles, rather than using this time to engage in combat, decided that sulking in his tent would be a better use of his energies. It was the perfect location for him to brood, sharpen his weapons with intensity, and endlessly debate his sense of self-worth. And then, of course, there was the issue of leadership. Agamemnon, the king of the Greeks, and the ultimate picture of bad management, had an unfortunate knack for making terrible decisions at the worst possible times. For starters, he managed to anger Achilles by taking Briseis, a prize he had no real claim to, but decided was now his. To Achilles, this was a declaration of war, except the war wasn't on Troy, it was on his sense of entitlement. In a move that would later be described as slightly overdramatic by historians, and annoying by anyone who had to listen to him, Achilles refused to fight. It wasn't that Achilles was afraid to die, or that he didn't think the war was worth winning. It was that, in Achilles' world, not getting enough recognition was worse than death. Being disrespected by Agamemnon was, for Achilles, the equivalent of being told your art was nice by a pretentious critic with a bad haircut. He was mad, furious. So mad that he packed up his emotional baggage and decided, rather than fighting, he would sit in his tent and sharpen his sword, just in case anyone came by to see how awesome he looked doing it. In his sulking state, Achilles' temper was only made worse by the continuous string of defeats the Greeks suffered without his involvement. It was all very predictable. Without their best warrior on the front lines, the Greeks began to lose ground. And when things started to get a bit too dire, Patroclus, ever the optimist, begged Achilles to join the fight once again. But no. Achilles wasn't about to just forgive and forget his perceived disrespect. Instead, he sulked some more, a lot more. He needed to feel that everyone knew just how mad he was. And so, naturally, Patroclus, who had clearly developed a martyr complex in his friendship with Achilles, took matters into his own hands. He borrowed Achilles' armour, because if he was going to die, he may as well die looking like a demigod, and led the Myrmidons into battle. If you're wondering what Achilles was doing during all of this, sharpening his sword, again, really getting into it. When Patroclus was killed in battle, Achilles was, to put it mildly, upset. He had probably expected a great deal of praise for not getting involved in the war until the very last possible moment. But now, with Patroclus dead, he felt a great deal of, well, everything. And by everything, I mean rage, guilt, a bit more rage, and a desire to make sure everyone knew just how dramatic he could be when someone took his best friend away from him. Thus, Achilles sprang into action, his self-pity fueling the flames of his legendary temper. He made it his personal mission to avenge Patroclus' death by doing what he did best, murdering people with excessive flair. But this time, he wasn't just murdering for glory. He was murdering for revenge. Revenge and glory, obviously. After all, a hero without revenge is just a guy with a sword. So, Achilles went on a rampage, killing Trojans left and right with all the charm and subtlety of a freight train. Finally, the moment of ultimate catharsis arrived. Hector, Prince of the Trojans, was standing in front of Achilles, ready for the inevitable. Hector had been the only person to really give Achilles a run for his money in the heroism department. But Achilles, driven by grief, rage, and a profound need to be the best at absolutely everything, struck him down. And then came the dramatic flourish. Achilles, with all the tact of a spoiled child, dragged Hector's body around the battlefield behind his chariot. Picture it. A grown man, a hero in his own mind, dragging a dead body like it was a particularly ugly midlife crisis sports car. It wasn't just about killing Hector. It was about showing the world that Achilles was the only one who deserved to be remembered. The gods watched in silence, not sure whether to feel pity for Hector or just admit that Achilles had taken his tantrum to the next level. As the body of Hector was dragged through the dirt, the gods may have exchanged glances and sighed, but the decision had been made, and Achilles had made his statement. He was unstoppable. He was not only a killer, he was an artist of revenge. And all of it was leading to an inevitable conclusion that everyone involved should have seen coming. The only thing Achilles had left to fight for was the fleeting, fragile concept of glory. And boy, was he going to fight for it. Achilles wasn't the kind of person who would ever be caught dead having a normal relationship. The entire idea of emotional availability was so foreign to him that he might as well have been asked to bake a souffle while juggling flaming swords. Emotionally volatile? Yes. Allergic to authority? Definitely. But when it came to romance, well, Achilles managed to craft quite a colourful portfolio, though colourful might be a bit of a stretch, considering he didn't do subtlety or commitment. His approach to love was more akin to a stamp collection, fragile, temporary, and ultimately not terribly well thought out. Let's start with Briseis. Briseis, the lovely war prize Achilles had borrowed from Agamemnon. Despite the fact that she was technically the spoils of war, and that Achilles had essentially taken her as a prize the way a child grabs the last cookie in a jar. He ended up getting rather attached. This attachment, which was probably closer to infatuation than healthy affection, only grew more intense when Agamemnon, in a classic display of bad decision-making, demanded her back. The loss of Briseis was, for Achilles, the equivalent of being told your pet hamster had been adopted by someone with a more exciting life. It wasn't about love. It was about the principle of the thing. Achilles had a very particular brand of love, one that could be described as possession masquerading as devotion. When he didn't get his way, like when Briseis was taken from him, he was furious. And when Achilles was furious, you could count on a 10,000-word soliloquy about how unfair life was, how unappreciated he was, and how nobody understood his greatness. This was followed by a complete withdrawal from any productive action, instead opting to brood in his tent, sulking as if Agamemnon had stolen his favourite childhood toy. While Achilles' attachment to Briseis was certainly inconvenient, it wasn't without merit. After all, he was the kind of person who could only love someone once they had been ripped away from him. When she was returned to him after his tantrum of epic proportions, you'd think he would have been overjoyed. Instead, Achilles clung to her with all the delicacy of a man who had just realised he had once again missed his opportunity to be emotionally available. But Briseis wasn't the only person Achilles had some form of relationship with. In fact, there were rumours, many rumours, about his feelings for Patroclus. The nature of their relationship has baffled scholars for centuries, and their debates are likely the only thing more entertaining than Achilles' actual heroism. Were they just friends? Were they lovers? Was there some form of unspoken bond between them that transcended the usual categories of Greek masculinity? Who knows? What we do know is that Achilles was definitely attached to Patroclus in a way that went beyond mere camaraderie. And let's not get into the academic debates that raged over their relationship. Those are the kinds of things you'd have to endure if you went back in time to one of those Greek philosophy salons, where everyone wore laurel wreaths and gestured excessively. Was it love? Was it brotherhood? Was it both? They'd ask, as if their opinions on the matter had any real bearing on Achilles' actions, or whether or not they could cure his chronic emotional constipation. Achilles was the first to acknowledge that being emotionally unavailable was his brand. He wasn't deliberately standoffish. It was more of an involuntary trait. He didn't know how to communicate affection because, as previously stated, he was far better at loving people once they were gone. So, while some may have speculated that his relationship with Patroclus was, in fact, one of the greatest love stories of the ancient world, Achilles was too busy sulking to give it much thought. After all, the relationship was only really important once Patroclus was dead. You see, Achilles' love life had a pattern. He would get close to someone, be impossibly beautiful, which was both an asset and a burden, and then, for reasons no one could quite explain, he'd either break things off or let the relationship fall apart. And when that person was no longer around to be emotionally confusing, then Achilles would go into full-on grieving romantic mode. This meant he had a tendency to look fondly on relationships once they were in the past. Nothing says true love like mourning someone after they've already been tragically killed. And let's talk about that beautiful face for a second. Achilles was, as one might expect, a handsome fellow. He looked like the kind of man who would appear on the cover of a Greek romance novel, preferably one where he was brooding on a cliff, staring off into the sunset. His beauty, however, wasn't exactly a ticket to emotional stability. If anything, it only complicated matters, because when you're that beautiful, it's easy to convince yourself that everyone should worship the ground you walk on, whether or not you actually have the emotional maturity to handle it. In fact, his beauty did nothing to help his emotional availability. Achilles, like many emotionally unavailable individuals, was great at receiving attention, but terrible at maintaining a connection. When Briseis was taken from him, he sulked. When Patroclus was killed, he launched into a revenge-fueled spree. All the while, he was inwardly convinced that his actions were justified because, well, Achilles was special. And if people didn't get that, then they were just too simple-minded to understand his magnificence. But his greatest and most tragic love story, as we know, came after Patroclus' death. It was then, as Achilles stood over his friend's grave, that he realised how deeply he had really loved him. Of course, this revelation came too late, far too late, and was more a reflection of Achilles' inability to process emotions in a timely manner than any genuine attempt to understand love. Patroclus' death brought out the most heart-rending qualities in Achilles. The desperation to feel something that wasn't just rage, the overwhelming need for revenge, and a sense of crushing guilt. But guilt in Achilles was about as useful as a dead man's last breath. When you're that beautiful and that dramatic, you don't have time to reflect on your failings. Instead, you strike down your enemies, and then, later, in private moments of quiet self-loathing, you gaze into a mirror and think about how sad it all is. This would have been the perfect setup for Achilles to pen some tragic poetry about lost love. But instead, he got lost in his own heroism and his burning desire to be the best at everything. And let's not forget the fact that, after all of this, Achilles became something of a tragic heartthrob, a figure adored by bards, poets, and people with an odd fondness for unrequited grief. He was the archetype of the hero who could never have what he wanted. He was the classic tragic hero, the misunderstood man with a heart full of unattainable desires, a man who couldn't figure out how to love anyone unless they were dead and cold. Achilles, in a sense, was a pioneer in the field of tragic heartthrobs long before the term was ever invented. He set the stage for all those later heartthrobs who would brood through the centuries, countless romantics who would idealize the dead lover. He was the first, the original, the one who made it acceptable to mope dramatically over a lost relationship and then tell people you were just processing. If Achilles had a modern equivalent, it would probably involve wearing a leather jacket and refusing to speak to anyone unless they could appreciate the depth of his suffering. But as the stories go, he would continue this tragic cycle, forever chasing something he could never quite grasp. Not love, not peace, and certainly not any kind of emotional maturity. Achilles was great at making a scene, but when it came to actual relationships, well, his track record was, let's say, unfinished. Achilles' death was, in many ways, as anticlimactic as his entire career. After all, the man had survived countless battles, faced gods, and slaughtered the best of Troy's finest, only to be felled by the most poetic form of irony imaginable, a single arrow to the heel. That's right, the mighty Achilles, who had everything going for him, strength, beauty, the whole hero package, was ultimately taken out by Paris, a prince who possessed exactly none of those qualities. To top it off, Paris wasn't even a warrior. He was a pampered, narcissistic man-child with no upper body strength, which is a bit like being defeated by someone who could barely lift a sandwich, let alone a sword. Let's pause here for a moment to really appreciate the tragedy of it all. Achilles' heel, the one part of him that wasn't made invincible by his mother's divine powers, was his Achilles' heel, quite literally. The rest of him as solid and bulletproof as a Greek statue, but that one weak spot was left conveniently unprotected. And so, Paris, with his all-around incompetence and unfortunate family ties, managed to do what no one else could: shoot a perfectly placed arrow straight into the tendon, the Achilles' heel. Poetic? Yes. Satisfying? Well, let's just say it would have made a great plot twist in a tragic comedy. The real tragedy, though, wasn't the arrow itself, or even the fact that Achilles died in such an embarrassingly small and specific way. No, the real tragedy was how immediately this incident became a cautionary tale. Achilles' death was the kind of thing that future generations would talk about in hushed tones, just as we talk about the perils of bad investments or the risk of wearing white after Labor Day. If only Achilles had covered his heel, the sages would say. If only he had protected that one tiny, very important part of his body, maybe he would have lived forever. And so, the hero who had survived countless battles, faced gods, and lived a life that would have made even the most hardened warriors jealous, died because he had a soft spot for, well, literally his soft spot. In death, Achilles achieved a sort of immortality, but not the kind he'd probably been hoping for. No, his immortality wasn't so much about his heroic deeds. Those, unfortunately, were quickly overshadowed by the whole heel debacle. Instead, he became a metaphor, a lesson in poor planning, and, perhaps most fitting of all, a prime example of the high price of a one-dimensional legacy. People didn't remember his countless victories. They didn't sing songs about the many times he'd fought in battle or the legions of men he had slain. No, what they remembered was the part of him that had failed. The one tiny flaw in an otherwise impeccable physique. And so, in a bitter twist of fate, Achilles became the ultimate embodiment of the lesson of overconfidence. He was a reminder that no matter how untouchable you think you are, there's always a tiny spot where you might get caught. In his case, it was the heel. In other cases, it's the way you treat your subordinates, or how you forget to diversify your stock portfolio. Posthumously, Achilles was given the treatment that any self-respecting hero deserves: statues, poems, and an abundance of awkward fan fiction. Yes, fan fiction. Picture this: a hero so great, so all-encompassing, that he became a muse for countless generations of teenagers who couldn't quite figure out how to express their emotions without the aid of fictionalized renditions of famous dead people. Achilles became a symbol of longing, of unrequited love, and of the terrible realization that he would never get the opportunity to make things right with anyone who had ever crossed him. In addition to the fan fiction, there were also the poems, the odes, the eternal praises sung to him in all corners of the Greek world. But let's be honest, most of them were written by men who never actually fought alongside Achilles. No, these were the poets, the artists, the people who hadn't been in the trenches with him, but had all the time in the world to reflect on his myth. And in their reflections, they painted Achilles as a tragic figure, the most tragic of heroes, whose one misstep had led to his untimely end. Meanwhile, in the world of branding, the name Achilles became synonymous with glory and power. If Achilles had lived in the modern era, he would have had a line of Nike shoes named after him. Specifically a line of shoes that focused on durability. Except for the heel. They'd be sold with the slogan, "Just do it, but watch your step." And a cheeky disclaimer warning that, while the shoes were great for running, they didn't offer full protection in case of extreme ankle injury. But the branding didn't stop there. Achilles was everywhere. Statues of him adorned the cities of Greece, his image carved into the finest marble, as if to say, "Look, this guy is so important that we've immortalized his body, even if that body didn't have a proper Achilles' protection plan." And while his battle skills were certainly mentioned, his real claim to fame was his vulnerability. In a world obsessed with perfection, Achilles became the symbol of the one thing that could bring down even the mightiest of men, a tiny flaw that was too easily ignored. Achilles probably would have preferred to be remembered for his strength, his skill in battle, or even his leadership, but no, he would be known for that damn heel. His ghost, if he had any say in the matter, probably spent eternity asking, why couldn't they just focus on the important stuff? The war, the rage, the fact that I was basically unstoppable in every other way? But that, my friends, is the price of legacy. The things people remember are rarely the things you'd want them to remember. So there Achilles sat in the great halls of the underworld, probably looking at the statues and wondering why his heel had become the focal point of his legacy. Wouldn't it have been nice if people had remembered him for the warrior he was? Instead, his immortality was reduced to a marketing campaign, a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence, paired with a catchy slogan and a logo that would survive millennia. But here's the thing about Achilles. He didn't really have any say in this. The ancient Greeks didn't focus on his deepest moments of introspection or his growth as a leader. They focused on the drama, the flaws, the thing that went wrong. In fact, they probably loved the drama more than they loved the actual heroism. After all, who cares about consistent excellence when you can have tragic failure with style? Achilles became the tragic heartthrob long before tragic heartthrobs were cool, and like all true tragic heroes, he paid the price for it. His body, once the perfect specimen of Greek beauty, became a symbol for the thing that everyone knew was going to take him down eventually. Achilles didn't get to choose what part of him would be immortalized. The gods didn't let him pick the legacy he would leave behind. Instead, they gave him the heel, a symbol of fragility in a world that was obsessed with perfection. But that, dear reader, is what happens when you die young and beautiful. You get immortalized not for the things that made you great, but for the one thing that everyone remembers. And so, Achilles, the greatest warrior of his time became the patron saint of bad planning, the mascot for You Had One Job. Which is probably a little unfair, but that's the thing about legacy. It's not about what you think you deserve to be remembered for. It's about what people choose to remember, and in Achilles' case, that was one tiny weak spot.